All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Neha Sangera, and I am the Policy Director at the Berkeley Food Institute. Let me stop sharing my screen before I do this. Wonderful. So I'm pleased to moderate today's webinar on transitions in farmland ownership and water access in California. Today's webinar will consist of short presentations from our three panelists. We will leave about 15 minutes at the end for an audience Q&A. Audience members are encouraged to submit your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to drop in your questions throughout the presentation. There's no need to wait until the very end. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce the three speakers for today's webinar. Paulo Dodorico is currently investigating the globalization of water through virtual water trade and international land investments and its impact on water equity, societal resilience, environmental stewardship, and food security. His research group is exploring the nexus among water, food, and energy security and identifying the legal and biophysical mechanisms of water appropriation and grabbing. The research focuses on identifying global patterns of land and water tenure and linkages between sustainability and justice in the context of fulfillment of human rights and the rights of nature. Welcome, Paulo. Jenny Rempel is a PhD student in the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley and a researcher with the Water Equity Science Shop. She studies water access, climate adaptation, and environmental justice to understand the drivers of water access disparities in rural and urban communities across California and the United States. Jenny works closely with grassroots organizations and decision makers to illuminate opportunities to eliminate drinking water injustices and ensure equitable climate adaptation. Welcome, Jenny. Benji Reed Malagueño is a PhD student focusing on water justice in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management here at UC Berkeley. Their research examines drivers of inequities in access to water rights, focusing on the impacts of water markets, land ownership, and agricultural exports in central Chile and California's Central Valley. Welcome, Benji. So thank you so much to our three panelists for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Paulo.
Thank you, Nia. I'm going to share my slides. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. And my part of the presentation will be mainly an introduction to water problems and water resources with a focus on California. And we will start with just the premise of this. The focus for this session has been mostly on water for agriculture, mainly because most of the human consumption of water resources is for food production, for agricultural production. And agriculture uses water in two different ways, both directly rainwater in rain-fed production and as irrigation water through irrigation when the land is irrigated. Worldwide, we have about 20% of the agricultural land is irrigated and contributes to the production of about 40% of the food. If we go specifically, we look at problems and issues for California. The main feature of the water regime in California is that we have a very well-defined rainy season, which is in winter time, and there is a mismatch between rainy season and growing season for many crops, in the sense that water is needed in spring and summertime, which are dry seasons. And so this often leads to the debate on the need for strategies to store water and use some of the water from the rainy season during the growing season. And this is particularly aggravated by the loss of snowpack and the decrease in winter precipitation coming on the Sierras as snow, which is a natural storage. So traditionally, the storage has been attained through surface water reservoirs and the construction of dams, which are often controversial because of the environmental impacts, the costs, and also having the ideal location to realize this type of infrastructure. There has been interest for other opportunities given by groundwater. The storage capacity of groundwater of the aquifers is huge, so there is a potential there to store water below ground. Of course, there are also some complications with that, but there is a lot of discussion about the use of managed aquifer recharge and also small-scale storages. So the other question is whose water? And so there is a whole field that studies water tenure as the relationship, either legal or customarily defined between people and the water resources they use. Identifying this field that tries to focus on the type of rights existing on water, what the so-called bundle of rights includes, whether it's a right to use, if it includes a right not to use water and without losing the right on water, the transferability of water rights, the exclusion of right of excluding other from access to a water source, and then rights to be involved in the processes of management and governance. And many times the definition of strong property rights on water which allow also for the transfer of those rights, is crucial for establishment of systems that are allocate water through water markets, and a process that is often called of commodification of water, which is the process through which a natural resource is turned into a commodity that can be traded and becomes also the focus of financial speculations. And then in the specific case of California, we have a hybrid system. So some, in general, what tenure systems can classified as systems in which the water is bound to the land. So there is a nexus between land rights and water rights. The property is called appurtenance. And this means that the acquisition of water rights occurs through the acquisition of land. And there are systems in which water rights are separated from land rights. And in California, we have this system. In that case, the question is whether whose water is this, whether water is a property of the state, is a private property, a property of a community, or is open access. In the specific case of California, we have that the surface water has some feature common to private property. And until recently, until the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, groundwater was treated more as an open access resource. We can see around the world areas where there are water rights and tradable water rights exist, where there is also some trading and of water, and other areas where this doesn't happen. So overall, there is an issue of a relationship among what we define as water tenure, which decides which is the set of norms and institutions that establish who can use water, who says that water is mine and has some claims on that water, and who has the possession of the water, so the physical control on water. So around the world, often there are situations of multiple claims on water resources, and then this leads often in a mismatch between who has possession of the water and who has the rights on that water. This leads to conditions that often are called appropriation or grabbing of water resources. And the appropriation of water, and this is more in a general context, can happen then through the acquisition of land, depending on the water rights existing in a certain part of the world, through the building of an infrastructure, can be a well, can be a dam. So someone becomes the gatekeeper and the controller of who has access to water resources. Then by polluting water, we exclude other people from having access to water. By planting trees, we reduce the downstream runoff, so we have a mechanism of appropriation of water. Through also land use, we can affect water resources existing somewhere else. And then when we adopt a more efficient irrigation system, we affect runoff, so we affect the downstream users. And also in some places, the control of water is through energy required for having extraction or withdrawals of water resources. In around the world, there has been a lot of investments in agricultural land. Often this land is in a preferential position in terms of having access to shallow water, groundwater, or proximity to rivers. And or in areas where there is not much of water scarcity, where there is good rainwater supply. Then the construction of infrastructure. This is a case of Africa. We did a study which we showed that the construction of large-scale infrastructure led to the emergence of new, irrigated areas, often to the benefit of large holders and commercial farming. So the question is often who's to the benefit of whom are large-scale water projects developed. And then many afforestation projects. This is a study we have done looking at areas that are suitable for afforestation, often for climate change mitigation, and and where this would engender an increase in water scarcity and competition with agriculture. Then the other issue is the change of irrigation system. In a broad sense, we can think of having three irrigation systems: a surface irrigation, which is flood irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, or drip irrigation. And these systems have different efficiency, which is measured as the ratio between the consumption, the amount of water used by crops, and the amount of water that is taken from the water source. And so higher efficiency mean that more water is used by crops, but this is at the expenses of the so-called return flows, which are critical for recharging groundwater and for allowing for downstream uses. And so there is an issue here of water tenure, of who owns the return flows, whether they are regulated, whether they should be regulated, and what is the impact of changes of irrigation systems on downstream users. And I've been talking before about large-scale investments in agriculture. There have been some cases also in California that have been in the news of investments that I define them as exogenous from investors from other parts of the country or also from other countries to invest in land because of good access to water. Lastly, the last remark I wanted to make, we've been looking at water as from a perspective of human uses. Of course, water resources have an important function also for nature, they provide aquatic habitat, and they are fundamental for the maintenance of biodiversity. And so there is a whole perspective on water that is not anthropocentric, but more ecocentric, and looks at also water, these environmental flows that are needed by nature, and also looks at the rights of nature on water resources. So with this, I think I completed this introduction, and I don't have much more to say. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that important overview and context. Go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you all see? Yes, perfect. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thank you, Paolo, for that excellent presentation. I'm going to turn now to talk about land transitions and land transactions as they relate to groundwater access in California. And this builds on work with Ella Belfer, Isha Ray, and Rachel Merlo-Frosch. So deep gratitude to my co-authors. And my goal with this work is really to start to make visible some of the ways in which land transactions relate to groundwater access. So I'll start with some background on land and water, with a focus on overlying rights to groundwater in California. And then I'll present results from recent land transactions research on farmland markets and groundwater access patterns, and conclude with a couple of takeaways. So Paula's work touched on this, and many of you may be familiar, but just in case, groundwater is a really important resource in our water source in California. So in an average year, 85% of Californians rely on groundwater for a portion of their water supply, and groundwater provides 40% of the water used by farms and cities. And climate-exacerbated droughts have historically increased groundwater use substantially. So during the 2011 to 2017 drought, groundwater offset nearly 70% of surface water declines, which raised concerns about the long-term sustainability of groundwater extraction, as well as underlying inequities in groundwater access across California. And that is when California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, during that drought. So the research I'll share today examines equity concerns of individual adaptation strategies by evaluating some of the links between land transactions and groundwater access. But we'll start with some history to set the context. So in 1850, a US court wrote that groundwater moves by influences beyond our apprehension. These influences are so secret, changeable, and uncontrollable, we cannot subject them to the regulations of law, nor build upon them a system of rules as has been done with streams upon the surface. And that decision reflects a really common understanding of groundwater in the exact year that California passed from Mexican to American rule. And then just a few years later, another court wrote that groundwater is so secret, occult, and concealed that an attempt to administer any set of legal rules would be involved in hopeless uncertainty and would be therefore practically impossible. So unlike surface water, which flows really visibly across property lines, groundwater has often appeared to judges and politicians as mysterious, unknowable, and difficult to govern. And so the common narrative is that we have not governed groundwater. And when SGMA passed in 2014, many newspaper headlines called it California's first groundwater rules. And as Paolo shared, groundwater has typically been considered more open access than surface water in California. Yet, groundwater was not entirely ungoverned before SGMA. Rather, access has been delineated through landed private property rights, and in particular, the institution of overlying rights. So early groundwater law gave landowners absolute dominion over water underlying their properties. The absolute dominion doctrine states that for whoever owns the soil, it is theirs up to the sky and down to the depths. And though this specific right has, of course, shifted some through time, that legal origin is still really at the heart of overlying rights today, which give landowners the right to extract groundwater underlying their properties and use it for a beneficial purpose. So in many groundwater basins in California, if you buy overlying land, you're also implicitly buying access to groundwater. And that is the right to drill a well and pump water, so long as you're not infringing on your neighbor's rights. And land ownership laws are thus really important in studying groundwater, because access to groundwater via overlaying rights depends on that land ownership. And within landed property rights regimes, certain social groups have been systematically excluded from farmland ownership. So federal and state governments have historically excluded Black farmers and Asian Americans from land ownership through acts like the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and the California Alien Land Laws of 1913 and 1920. And simultaneously, joint ownership and inheritance laws prevented women from owning or inheriting farmland through the mid-19th century. So these land-based exclusions not only impact intergenerational legacies of land and wealth transfer, but also because the primary way most California users access groundwater is via overlying rights, which necessitate land ownership, these land exclusions also fundamentally structure groundwater access in California. And there is a lot more history here, but hopefully this brief overview of overlying rights and land ownership provides some context for the longer histories of land and water that shape present-day land and water access dynamics in California. So with that background, I'll turn to a more recent quantitative analysis, keeping that history in mind. So because of overlying rights, the land market plays a substantial role in allocating groundwater access across the state, which is important because who owns land and accesses groundwater may also change over time through the land market. And we know from the agricultural literature that there are declines in individual farmland acquisitions and that farmland is increasingly being acquired through limited liability companies or LLCs. But those land ownership trends and land transition trends have not been analyzed or not previously been analyzed in terms of groundwater use. And so because these trends have been primarily treated as land trends, not land water trends, we haven't seen much about how land transitions relate to groundwater use. And at the same time, much groundwater research focuses on volumes rather than users, which leaves a gap in our understanding of how different groundwater users access water. And so doing, we've sidestepped critical questions about water access in a changing climate. So in between those two gaps, I ask, with co-authors, we ask, what are recent arm's length farmland turnover trends in California and how might they affect groundwater access? And here, arm's length just refers to independent market transactions rather than inheritance or transfers within families. And second, did landowner types drill wells differently in the San Joaquin Valley during the most recent drought? So turning to our methods, to characterize farmland turnover trends that may have adverse implications for groundwater access and sustainability, we developed a comprehensive statewide data set tracking farmland sales over groundwater basins, and we identified wells drilled on recently sold parcels. So we joined data on land transaction, groundwater, and well construction records in California for the 55,000 parcels on 3 million overlying agricultural acres sold over our 15-year time period. And from a data set of buyer records, we identified 4 different types of buyers, including limited liability companies or LLCs, non-LLC companies, individuals, and family investors, which includes family trusts, IRAs, and other family investment vehicles. And then we focus in on a subsample of almost 1,200 wells built in the San Joaquin Valley and used a generalized additive model to test whether buyer type affects well depth, which is often used as a proxy for water access in the absence of volumetric pumping data. And so now I'll turn to 3 main results that I'd like to share with you today. First, we found that turnover rates were higher overlying groundwater basins than on farmland that was not overlying groundwater. So over our 15-year study period, of the 3 million agricultural acres overlying groundwater in California, 21% or 1/5 were sold via the land market. And as you can see from this table on the left, that rate was highest in basins the state has identified are facing groundwater sustainability challenges at 23.5% of acres bought at least once in these critically overdrafted basins. And these high turnover rates merit attention because high turnover rates may change multiple characteristics related to water extraction and use, such as farm size and the predominance of new owners. And under California's new groundwater governance system under SGMA, they also might affect who can participate in local groundwater governance. And the map on the right just indicates how the percent of agricultural acres transacted at least once over this time period varies by groundwater basin around the state. And the second result I'll share is that it's not only that land is changing hands, but that who or really what owns overlying farmland is changing. So farmland turnover during this time period enabled substantial shifts in who acquired groundwater rights. And indeed, the composition of buyers changed. So land trends signal increasing corporate farmland acquisitions overlying groundwater. So over the time period, LLC transitions in teal substantially, steadily increased over the time period. While in green, you can see a decline in individual farmland acquisitions. And these large-scale transitions are important because they imply substantial changes in groundwater rights, where these corporate or company-based forms are increasingly mediating relationships to overlying land and by extension to groundwater. And third, our results show that these land trends have implications for water access. So we show that well deepening is not happening evenly. New corporate farmland owners were associated with drilling agricultural wells that are 77 to 81 feet deeper than those drilled by new individual landowners on parcels that are comparable in size, location, and crop type. And in some sense, it's unsurprising that better capitalized entities drill deeper wells, but this work demonstrates that particular types of new farmland owners are systematically drilling deeper wells. And these deeper wells raise sustainability concerns. For example, pumping from greater depths can increase the energy intensity of water supplies. SGMA should mitigate undesirable groundwater impacts regardless of well depth, but since we've yet to see whether SGMA will be implemented successfully, these differences in well depth that we've identified here are important, especially since recent research indicates that groundwater levels may continue declining even under SGMA. And so in this context, our results indicate a structural inequity in users' vulnerability to future groundwater level declines. And so that means that with future water level declines, companies may be less likely than individual farm owners to face disruptions in their groundwater access. And because SGMA makes depth to groundwater a regulatory standard now, well depth is actually codified as really key to groundwater access. So even relatively small differences in well depth can actually have important implications and important differences in vulnerability to water declines. So stepping back, I'll close with some takeaways from this research. First, the land market has a role in shaping groundwater access, and that's long been the case. And second, as just discussed, this work identifies a potential structural inequity in exposure to future water level declines, such that on recently purchased parcels, new corporate well owners will on average be less vulnerable to groundwater depletion than new individual well owners. And because challenges accessing groundwater are expected to only become more profound under climate change, these results have implications for near-term groundwater governance, which can define sustainable management in terms of depth to groundwater. And so therefore, these land ownership and groundwater use may be really key considerations for local groundwater sustainability agencies seeking to ensure not only groundwater sustainability, but also equity of access. And overall, this project refocuses attention on the need to understand land and water rights in tandem in efforts to ensure successful groundwater governance. So with that, I will close with another deep thanks to my co-authors for work on this project. And I will turn it over to Benji, who will pick up on some more recent trends.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. I'll just share my slides now as well. Great, awesome. And so yeah, thank you to Neha, Paula, and Jenny for the previous information. I'm gonna extend what Jenny's just discussed a bit with a current project that we've just been working on with Jenny, Paula, and some other colleagues on connecting inequalities in land ownership and groundwater access in the Central Valley. So first, kind of a brief roadmap. Just a quick introduction, talk a bit about the methods for our project, and then dive into kind of results and discussion of inequality and land-water relationships. And so, yeah, I'll start off just with a very brief introduction because Paolo and Jenny did a great job of kind of setting the scene. But as Paolo and Jenny described, due to this kind of overlying rights doctrine, land and water rights are really fundamentally tied together. And these recent trends in kind of the financialization and commodification of croplands have very important implications for groundwater access. And so we wanted to kind of build off some of the work that has been done and that Jenny presented on and others have investigated, looking specifically at inequality and kind of who owns croplands, who has access to groundwater access, and really as well about how the two are tied together in terms of do, for example, larger landowners who own more cropland also have kind of disproportionate access to groundwater access. Yeah, and we thought this kind of baseline of inequality in these relationships was also really important given the changes kind of ongoing and in the future that Paulo and Jenny referred to as a result of the Sigma and the kind of subsequent policies. So yeah, just kind of briefly to give you an idea of how we constructed the different data. Similar to in Jenny's project, the kind of key aspect was to pair cropland parcels boundaries alongside wells so that we can see kind of which landowners own which wells and vice versa, as well as some kind of additional processing in terms of like Paulo said, really focusing on kind of irrigation wells and croplands, so that we're looking specifically kind of at the agricultural realm. And so we kind of compiled this final data set of around 133,000 cropland parcels. And then this data set of kind of parcel well matches, each of which kind of was assigned to an owner. And then, yeah, to kind of be able to calculate metrics of inequality and kind of distributions of ownership and access. And the other key step was kind of to aggregate some of these croplands and groundwater access metrics by owner. And so, for example, that was things like calculating the total cropland area or land value that each owner owns across kind of multiple parcels. And then similarly for groundwater access, for example, how many wells each owner owns, or if we're looking at well capacity, which is kind of how much total volume is kind of the maximum that one can pump out of a given well. We did that, for example, by if a given owner owns 3 different wells across multiple parcels, we would just kind of sum up all those well capacities as a metric of groundwater access in terms of that's the maximum volume of groundwater they could theoretically pump out. And yeah, and so kind of once we had those aggregated metrics of carbon ownership and groundwater access by owner, we could start to get into the results of inequality and the relationship between those two. So first, for inequality, I'll just quickly give some context. One of the key metrics for inequality that we'll use throughout the presentation is the Gini coefficient. And it's typically or originally was used kind of in economics specifically to measure income inequality. And so perhaps that might be familiar to some of you, what you've seen in the past. And it ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 indicates, for example, if we're looking at the cropland area owns, that everyone owns the same amount of cropland area. And then a value of 1 is perfect inequality. So that would mean just one owner owns all of Central Valley's cropland, for example. And to give you a reference of kind of typical values, like I mentioned in the world of income inequality, um, this is kind of a given range between some of the countries that have kind of are on the lower and higher end of this spectrum. And so, for example, I guess one big takeaway is that we see these inequalities are all very high, both for kind of some of the cropland ownership metrics as well as for the groundwater access metrics. And if it's easier kind of to or more intuitive, these are kind of some additional metrics of inequality as well. So for example, this box here indicates that the top percentile of cropland owners owns 30 or around 31% of kind of all of the cropland area in the Central Valley. and likewise for the kind of top 10% of owners, for example. Um, and so yeah, again, we see that these numbers are quite high due to the kind of systemic inequities built into who has access to land and water that Jenny described, probably unsurprising. Um, and then one other thing I want to point to as a kind of key takeaway is that you can see that kind of across the board, across these different inequality metrics, that the cropland ownership metrics in general are quite higher than the groundwater access metrics. And so we can kind of see that this is evidence of wider inequalities in cropland ownership than groundwater. And then jumping to the relationship between land and groundwater. Um, Similarly, we kind of broke up cropland owners based on the cropland area that they had into percentiles, where kind of this end of the spectrum is the largest landholders, and this was the kind of smallholders. And then the y-axis here indicate kind of the total well capacity and the total well depth on average that different owners that are grouped into these different percentiles have. So, for example, on average, we see that the largest landowners um, own overwhelmingly kind of cumulative, a lot more well capacity and a lot more well depth compared to smallholders. And we can see that this is definitely not kind of a linear trend. It definitely kind of ramps up as we get towards the largest landholders. And so kind of this is telling us that large landowners own overwhelmingly greater kind of groundwater access metrics. And then to kind of quantify this a bit further, if it helps for every 1% increase in total cropland area owned, we see a 0.43 and then a 0.35% increase for well capacity and well depth owned, respectively. And yeah, for those curious, we find that these trends are driven both by the fact that larger landowners have own overwhelmingly more wells, as shown in this graph, and then also in these two graphs that per well, they also tend to have deeper wells and larger capacity wells. So they not only kind of can access more groundwater just through the sheer amount of wells, but also per well kind of they have more access to that. Yeah, and then we are also interested in these are kind of aggregate ownership metrics, and we are also interested in seeing kind of what happens if we compare groundwater access, but per hectare of cropland owned. And here the narrative shifts quite a lot in the sense that we see that the larger landholders, again on this side of the spectrum, uh, have while they have overwhelmingly greater groundwater access, they actually have a lot lower groundwater metrics, again, both through well depth and well capacity when we normalize it by hectare of croplands. And so this is telling us kind of in tandem with the inequality that we saw before of lands being more unequally distributed than groundwater access. That as we ascend from kind of the smallholders to the largest landholders, yes, there's really wide inequalities in both land and groundwater, but we see that land area is increasing a lot more quickly as we get towards those larger landholders than groundwater access does. Yeah, and then kind of I'll quickly go through some of the possible explanations or implications for why these kind of trends could be occurring. One idea and kind of an extension of analysis that we did was that perhaps the kind of top landowners have more access to surface water as well, and so that's why they have less groundwater per hectare, for example, because they're also relying on surface water in addition to groundwater. And so we see some evidence of that in the sense of this y-axis demonstrates the percent of cropland parcels that intersect either public water districts or private trusts that we think likely have surface water access through means such as the State Water Project. And so again, we see it flattens out, but we do see the kind of that, for example, smallholders have less of these parcels within those surface water district boundaries. And so that could provide some evidence that this is one factor contributing to those trends that we find. Another possible explanation is that larger landholders, just due to the economies of scale, are able to kind of more efficiently draw upon well and irrigation infrastructure, um, whereas kind of those economics of well drilling and might just require smallholders to build out more wells and more well capacity kind of per hectare of cropland, since they're not able to rely on those economies of scale over larger kind of swaths of cropland. And then one final possible explanation is kind of related to what Paulo talked about and Jenny regarding the kind of juxtaposition of groundwater as this open access resource that is more on the unregulated side compared to cropland. And so we see that perhaps this historical lack of regulation on groundwater, in which even smallholders, as long as they own land with the resources to drill a well, could access groundwater in theory. And whereas cropland, again, even going back historically, is this clearly defined property rights as tenure system that can be bought and sold and is tradable on a market. And so one possible implication could be that this kind of with croplands being this kind of commodified good, perhaps that generated more inequalities leading up to now than groundwater, where open access could have been kind of a more equalizing force in comparison to croplands. And so this possible explanation also has important implications for the kind of potential commodification of groundwater that Paulo discussed through Sigma. We're seeing some discussion of groundwater markets being implemented through groundwater sustainability plans as a result of Sigma, and indeed some in some areas these are already starting to be implemented. Um, and so we see evidence in other parts of the world that have water markets like the ones that Paulo describes that uh, this kind of commodification of groundwater has widened inequality and led to further consolidation. And and so yeah, that's kind of a possible implication given this possible explanation of. And then just to wrap up by talking about some broader implications, and regardless of kind of those various explanations, it's important to kind of dig further and find out into each of them. And but overall, our results just present kind of this further evidence of substantial inequality in both cropland ownership and groundwater access. And we see large landowners possessing overwhelmingly greater groundwater access. And so again, this just points to the importance of prioritizing and monitoring equity outcomes as groundwater policies start to be implemented through Sigma. And this is especially important in some of the areas that are facing the greatest water stress. And we find some evidence that inequality in metrics such as well depth and improved land values, which we can see in the maps here, tend to be higher, wider inequality in some of these areas that, for example, have lower precipitation or are critically depleted as designated by the Department of Water Resources. And so, again, this points into the interlinkage that Jenny talked about between sustainability and equity outcomes, and really how important it is to kind of monitor both in tandem and ensure that the future policies are kind of treating both as the interlinked kind of phenomena that they are. And so, yeah, thank you all for listening. Thank you to Berkeley Food Institute for the opportunity. I'm very grateful. And yeah, happy to discuss any questions and follow-ups along with Jenny and Paulo.
Thank you, Benji. That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm really struck by the table of inequality that you laid out. I think it really paints a very clear picture in terms of the state of land ownership and access to water in the Central Valley. We do have a number of really great questions in the hopper, so I will just kind of go in the order of what we've been receiving. The first question is for Jenny. Does political influence by land-owning corporations significantly negatively affect the ability of state legislation and policy to mitigate the unequal access to groundwater in California?
Thanks for this question. I think it's really important, so I'm glad you asked it. The research I've presented obviously doesn't study this question exactly, but I think it is really important to track the implications of these farmland and water trends for groundwater governance at the state level, and then also more locally with groundwater sustainability agencies as well. So an important question that certainly merits more research.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for the question as well, Delia. The next question, I invite any of our three panelists to respond to this from Camille Frazier at the Strategic Growth Council. Thank you for these informative presentations. How would you recommend that land markets be reshaped to better account for the trends that you've shared? What kinds of policy interventions would be effective in addressing these inequities? It's a big question.
I can jump in and just share some thoughts on the second portion of the question as well. Maybe all Benji and Paulo are thinking too. Yeah, thanks for the question, Camille. I'll speak a little bit to some of the implications for groundwater governance, which I started to get into in the talk, and then we can think more about land markets as well. But the results certainly have implications for groundwater governance, and in part because, as I was sharing, Sigma defines sustainable management of groundwater partly in terms of depth to groundwater. So, we're 10 years into Sigma implementation, and I think it's a time where we need to remain attentive to land ownership patterns in groundwater governance, since land ownership is also related to who gets to sit on governing boards, to recharge, to emerging markets, and then the equity concerns we highlighted about groundwater levels raise some serious considerations for local groundwater governance. And so this work overall, with this preliminary characterization of structural inequities and users' vulnerability to future groundwater level declines, it really focuses attention on the need to ensure regulatory standards for depths to groundwater prevent undesirable impacts for all beneficial users of groundwater, and not just those who can drill deeper wells. So we really need to make sure that regulatory standards are not inadvertently privileging some groundwater users over others. So those are some thoughts on groundwater governance interventions, but leave it to Benji and Paulo for more.
I don't have much more to add, so I was Benji, I'll let you talk.
Yeah, no, sure. Just a quick addition to what Jenny mentioned. I'm not as familiar with land markets specifically in California, but again, getting to kind of the implications for groundwater access at least. And we see in other parts of the world that there are kind of prioritizations based on land use or kind of the water use more specifically, like Jenny alluded to. Um, in terms of kind of prioritizing domestic use, for example, and there kind of being clear hierarchies in terms of which environmental needs, for example, as another one that is prioritized. And yeah, so just another thought that that's kind of one way that other policymakers have tried to kind of get around the fact that people who own more land are going to tend to have more access to both ground and surface water.
Wonderful. Thank you for those responses. The next two questions, I'm feeling like we can bundle them a little bit. They both relate to Sigma as well as how Sigma impacts land values. So the question is, what has been the influence of Sigma on the price of cropland, especially in the area of basins around Bakersfield, California? And can you say more about the role of Sigma in terms of land values and who's buying farmland in the Central Valley and what the impacts would be to small and mid-scale farmers?
Jump in some. I don't know exactly around Bakersfield, and I think certainly more research is needed to understand Sigma's role in cropland values. But as many folks on the call probably know, we have seen a decline in farmland values last year, which, like the farmland transitions I was sharing, can really have the possibility for reshaping agricultural landscapes. There are, of course, many other things in play at this moment in time. We've seen, I think, lower commodity prices as well. So there are certainly changes in farmland values, and that is an important topic that fortunately many agricultural economists are studying as well.
And I'm particularly intrigued by the portion of the second question that asks who is currently buying farmland in the Central Valley. And Jenny, I'm remembering the chart that you pulled up and the trend you identified of LLCs increasing ownership in the Central Valley. I'm curious, are you able to disaggregate the data for LLC ownership? I'm curious if you have more information on how they vary in size, for example, or where the ownership is located, whether it's in California, the US, outside of the US. Do you have any kind of high level trends that you're able to share on that?
I don't have trends on that from my work. I agree, it's a really important question. We looked at LLCs just because they're, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively new corporate form that's become quite popular in agriculture. But certainly these types of data sets enable questions about who specifically is acquiring land. Interestingly, our models did not show a statistically significant difference between non-LLC and LLC well depth for new wells on recently acquired parcels within this company category. But we did see increases in the proportion of property purchased through LLCs. So the difference in well depth between LLCs and non-LLC companies as compared to individuals and family investors, I think is very notable.
Jen. The next question is from Sarah Sarfati Epstein, a student with the Energy Resources Group here at UC Berkeley. I'm curious if you all have any thoughts on the role of the Department of Conservation's multi-benefit land repurposing program.
I can say something. I think depending on where the land is located, there is because of Sigma, there will be the need to reduce the water use for irrigation. In some places, it can be substantial. So the same areas cannot be, the same amount of land cannot be irrigated. And so there is the repurposing programs have been designed to find other uses for the land, either rain-fed productions in some cases, or other uses. It could be, I don't know specifically what the Department of Conservation is planning, but agrivoltaic can be another option, or the use of land for grazing or for wildlife or other uses. So all these are basically is just a necessity due to the fact that we cannot keep irrigating the land at the same rate as it used to be before. And so I think depending on where the land is located, there is for sure the need to not only to leave the land fallow, but to find other ways to use that land. So I think these efforts are all trying to find other uses that can be good economic uses and good with good also environmental outcomes.
Well, thank you, Paulo. This next question has to do with groundwater quality. So the question reads, I realize Sigma focuses on groundwater access, but I'm curious if groundwater quality came up during your different research projects, namely rising nitrate levels, making its use further inequitable, problematic.
Our project doesn't touch on water quality issues like nitrate, for example, specifically. But no, definitely an important point because that's definitely tied to inequities, especially for some of the like on the spectrum more close to the smallholder end, like what we described, is definitely a barrier to like even if someone has a well, for example, and that well capacity or well depth is in theory and there they might not be able to actually extract that or on a lot of small farms as well of like that I've been to there's kind of joint domestic use and agricultural use as you get towards like smaller parcels too, so it's definitely interlinked but not part of the project that I shared about.
And I would just echo that and say that Sigma does also focus on groundwater quality. It is under Sigma's purview, but yes, it was not part of our research project.
Wonderful. And with that, we are unfortunately out of time. So I'd once again like to thank our three panelists, Jenny, Benji, and Paulo, for presenting their incredible research and work with the BFI audience. And thank you to all the attendees who joined us today and in support of the BFI webinar series. We're so glad you were able to join us. If you'd like to stay in touch with BFI, I would suggest you go to our website, food.berkeley.edu, and also sign up for our newsletter, which is a really good way to keep up to date on our upcoming news and events. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.